Welcome to Spring LIB.
All right, so for this question, we should kind of start by remembering what happens in a lake throughout the year that would allow organisms to survive in it even when it's, frozen over. Um, Over the course of the year, especially in like a area where this hypothetical lake is, you're going to have a thermocline, which means, there will be striations of temperature differences across the lake. In the summer, the top, the sun is going to be beating down, so the upper layers will be hotter and then the lower layers will be colder. In the winter, especially as the ice starts to kind of melt, the upper layer will be colder relative to the bottom layers. And then as like in the spring and fall, these changes, because cold water will tend to be more dense, will actually will move towards the bottom, which will push up the water in the bottom, and that pushing up will bring up dead organisms and nutrients and things dissolved in the water that will be beneficial for life living in the lake. Now that we kind of have that understanding down, let's think about what happens when the lake freezes over. So winter comes and the temperature drops and it gets to the freezing point of water. So we have, the surface layer will be the one most affected first because it will freeze because of the temperature it's hitting is, at the freezing level. But what that does is, because, we're also in a thermocline, so the layers below it already have different levels of like temperature variation, so they will respond differently to changes in temperature. It also acts as a barrier between the water itself and the cold air. So yes, while this part of the water is close to ice, it's also being protected from the, freezing point of the air around it. And because of how the density in the lake is sort of situated, this prevents the entire lake from freezing over. Now that we kind of have that down, let's read our answer choices and see, which one kind of makes the most sense based on what we know so far, what we can kind of figure out based on visualization. Option A states that the ice falls on the surface because it's less dense than water. That's true. Water, since it's at 7 degrees Celsius, that is false. We can throw this out because water density is at its highest at 4 degrees Celsius. This is mentioned in the textbook, and you should probably remember it because it's a very important figure. I think an easy way to remember that is it's not entirely grammatically correct, but 4 is more denser. Sure. Basically, the number in option A is wrong, so we can go ahead and shut that out. Option B, aquatic life exists underwater during the winter because they consume more resources so they can survive. That's not exactly the case. I mean, there are resources available in the detritus in the bottom of the lake, but they don't really stockpile. They continually, feed on this throughout the winter. It also doesn't really describe what's happening with the ice itself and maybe why the rest of the lake isn't freezing. Option C, the layer of ice forms on the surface of the water as ice is less dense than water. So this option is giving us the reason why the rest of the water doesn't freeze. Water is, since it's at 4 degrees Celsius, that's correct. And then, we know because of this that the rest of the lake is liquid, so aquatic life is surviving with everything that's already there. Option D is almost exactly the same, except it states that ice forms on the surface and a few meters below the surface. Now, while if this were the case, then that ice would still float to the surface because it is less dense than the water that it's on top of. So it would still technically be on the surface of the water, not submerged in it, if that makes sense. So based on careful reading of these answer choices and visualizing what's going on, I think it's safe to say, and also by knowing that 4 degrees Celsius, 4 is more denser in terms of water density and temperature level relationships. I think it's safe to say that C is our